Where's the Palestinian people's apology from the British state for spending almost 2 centuries constructing a project of racist mass murder that views them as not a people? The land has no people. They're these subhuman savages that can be murdered en masse because they're not Jewish. They're just like, I'm outraged. I want to speak to the police, or I want to speak to a regulator. Like, they're just curtain twitching little dweebs. Like, that's their whole strategy. Like, we could adopt that strategy. I think it's pathetic. Like, I mean, where I come from, snitches get stitches, and we don't complain like that. Like, oh, I want to speak to the manager. You go into court and you just go like, what? You think all anti-Zionists are anti-Semitic? Like, okay, well, I'm here to tell you that I think all Zionists are racist. How do you feel about that? And they're just like, you can completely flip the script.
Hello and welcome to Attrition. I'm your host, Ammar Kazmi. In this show, we delve into the forces of war, imperialism, and Zionism, exploring their impact on our world and what it will take to overcome them. I'm delighted to be joined today by the tireless campaigning barrister, Franck Magennis. Franck was born in Dublin, was raised in the occupied 6 counties in the north of Ireland, and was called to the Bar of England and Wales in 2016, practicing in the areas of criminal defence, civil law, and public law. He's worked against states, employers, and landlords, and has a particular expertise in claims relating to Palestinians and anti-Zionists in the struggle against Israeli colonialism and genocide. Thank you very much for joining me today, Franck.
Great to be here, comrade. Thank you for having me.
I'd like to start by discussing with you the concept of terrorism and the legal framework in which so-called terrorism is dealt with. So just to give our viewers a bit of a potted history, the legal framework came into existence in Britain in the latter half of the 20th century to manage armed resistance in the north of Ireland. And indeed, the Terrorism Act 2000 ultimately comes about as a result of the Irish question, because this is pre-9/11. And so the primary idea of terrorism throughout the world at that point lies within anti-communism, anti-Irish policy. It hasn't yet transmogrified into this largely Islamophobic tool, which is how we principally see terrorism legislation today. Although saying that, the likes of Bernard Lewis had for decades before 9/11 pushed the idea of so-called Islamism, and he'd pushed the agenda alongside the Zionist movement of associating Islam with terrorism. But that didn't really pick up currency across the world until much later. But in any case, at the core of this concept of terrorism appears to be that the state has a monopoly on violence. Now, that isn't a novel idea necessarily, but with the Terrorism Act 2000, that idea becomes really solidified in the history of modern nation states. But what exactly is terrorism? Is there really any such thing as terrorism? I mean, some people like to talk about state terrorism, for example, or they like to reverse it onto their enemies by talking about Zionist terrorism. But is this a meaningful word to be using in any situation?
I think it's a great question, and perhaps it's helpful to think about it in terms of a distinction between the legal and the political, but it's also very useful to think about it historically. So maybe taking those in reverse order, the term terrorism, as I understand it, comes from the French Revolution. So there was this sort of political violence. You had the Jacobin, militant flank of the French revolutionaries who called for this kind of, violence against their class enemies. And that's as a matter of etymology where the term comes from, right? And you talk about the terror. And then, of course, in the Russian Revolution, you talk about the terror, right? And Lenin is criticized for advocating for the use of terror. So I think it has this interesting historical trajectory. And then, as you say, it comes to be almost co-opted by states, by bourgeois states, as a tool for attacking their political enemies. And, there's this Weberian idea about the state having a monopoly on the use of force that does seem to play into the way that a lot of bourgeois states deploy the term terror, right? I think as a matter of politics, it is still useful to think about, I think common sense understandings of terrorism tell us something. There is this idea that, like, look, arguably what the FLN was doing in Algeria included an approach of going into, civilian targets and planting bombs. And there's an idea that you're trying to sort of psychologically defeat the French colonizer in that case. Like, it's a kind of tactic, right? And you see it in the Palestinian context and other contexts at various points. I think in particular in the wake of Barak Goldstein, right, the Zionist settler who went into Al Ibrahimi Mosque in Hebron and massacred, I think, 29 people and injured over 100 with a machine gun. Like, you can see how people might say that seems like terrorism, right? It's a fanatical settler going into a civilian place of worship and murdering people as part of a political strategy that's designed to make Palestinians feel terrified, right? I think intuitively that does tell us something, right? That's different from what you might call a conventional warfare, where there's an idea that you should leave civilians alone and you should only attack military targets, people who've chosen to join an army or have been conscripted into an army and have therefore, in one way or another, agreed to assume certain risks. So that's this kind of political lay conception of terrorism, which we might think has some uses, but I tend to agree that it's a term to be used with caution. And I also think it's a term that's been really sullied by its co-option and use by states. But legally, terrorism should be abolished as a legal concept. It's not a useful legal concept. If it ever had any kind of use, it has now become totally associated with states like Britain attempting to essentially politicize criminal law. And so you think about what's happening when people are charged with these so-called terrorism offenses. And the Palestine Action example that I'm sure we'll come to is useful here, right? It's like, what does Palestine Action do? They go into arms factories and they smash them up, right? We have a crime for that. It's called criminal damage. What's being added by saying that it's terrorist criminal damage? Like, oh, you're trying to terrorize the population. It just strikes me as a ridiculous attempt to create an extremely, it's sort of like anathema to law, right? Law is supposed to be this relatively dispassionate, precisely defined set of criteria, which we have in a country like, a jurisdiction like England and Wales. We have these well-defined criminal offenses. And so what's clear is that what's happening with terrorism legislation as it applies specifically to the criminal law is that it's this attempt to stigmatize political opponents, right? So that's one thing to be said. And then in terms of how it's defined in English law, it is astonishing, right? Section 1 of the Terrorism Act 2000 is an extremely broad definition. And it's amusing to me because I had been talking about this Hamas application, which I think we'll come to, in various of the press and obviously in the legal proceedings and so on. This was a key part of our argument. We were like, look, have you read Section 1? It's extremely broad, the definition of terrorism, right? It doesn't even have to be violence against people. And to be concerned in terrorism, you can merely be sort of advocating for it or supporting it without actually doing any of it yourself. And then sure enough, the British state comes along and says, non-violent direct action group like Palestine Action that only does violence against property, but technically it's caught by this extremely expansive definition. So the interesting point that I'm trying to make is that I think you're right that in a lot of cases, US definitions of terrorism, certain EU definitions of terrorism, UN sanctions lists, all the rest of it, there's this idea that terrorists are supposed to be non-state actors. But in the case of the Terrorism Act 2000, that's not the case, right? Section 1 just says, provides a definition of what terrorism is. The definition doesn't mention state or non-state actors, right? So that's why you see among the more ridiculous racist parts of the British establishment this call for example, the Islamic Revolutionary Guards to be proscribed as a terrorist organization, right? That's the official army. It's an official state body of a recognized nation state. It doesn't stop the British establishment from trying to prescribe them as terrorists if they want to. And so it's a point I made in passing in some of the public commentary that I made on this Hamas application. If the Secretary of State wanted to, she could prescribe the Israeli occupation forces. But in my opinion, the correct political position certainly, is that we should be abolishing terrorism legislation. Those laws shouldn't exist. And so suggesting, we should deploy these laws against our enemies is a really dubious strategy. And it feels to me like legitimizing something that is illegitimate and should be abolished.
Well, you mentioned just now how this terrorism legislation is vague in terms of applying to state actors or non-state actors. So this legislation that we have in Britain and in other parts of the world can be and is applied in some cases to state actors. In the case of Hamas, because it's the government of Gaza. You also have Hezbollah in Lebanon, which has 2 government ministers. And you also now have this attempt to prescribe the IRGC, the Iranian Revolutionary Guards, even though they're a state actor. This prescription regime, this way of designating particular organizations as terrorists, needs to be talked about. Now, I've known you and I've known of your work for some years, and that's been a great privilege. But you have now gained fame or perhaps infamy in some
Depends
circles.
who you talk to.
Depends on who you talk to, for representing Hamas in their bid to be de-proscribed, to be removed from the list of terrorist organizations in Britain. So they've put in an application for de-proscription to the Home Secretary. What exactly is this proscription regime, and why, in your view, is it important for Hamas to be de-proscribed?
Well, I think, again, history is helpful here because you can't understand the Terrorism Act 2000 without understanding what you identified correctly was the precursor so-called emergency legislation that was deployed in the north of Ireland. So that was a domestic regime, right? It was designed to deal with the fact that within the territory of the so-called United Kingdom, there was a national liberation struggle. And I would say quite a sophisticated one. Very sophisticated groups like the Provisional IRA and the Irish National Liberation Army were fighting what they said was a war. Both of those organizations were, as far as they were concerned, armies fighting a decolonial, anti-colonial resistance campaign. And so the British state had this problem, which was within its own domestic jurisdiction, but in its oldest colony, there was a growing constituency of people who didn't want to be a colony of the British Empire and were willing to fight for their liberation, right? This sort of incomplete project of Irish national liberation. And so the problem is that when you're fighting an army, the Geneva Conventions apply and you treat your enemy combatants like they're soldiers in a war and you can intern them. And that's what Britain did in 1971, right? Operation Demetrius. They lifted thousands of Catholics out of their homes, often on the basis of really shoddy intelligence, and just didn't charge them or try them with any kind of criminal offenses. It was wartime measures. And so the British Empire, being the British Empire, they came up with some euphemism for what was effectively POW status. So they're like, we have to treat these people like POWs because we're treating them like POWs. We're treating them like combatants in a war, not charging them with any offenses. So they came up with this euphemism, special category status, and then that leads to this escalation in the struggle, because having bestowed this status, they realized they were kind of bestowing the status of an army on their enemies. And so they tried to take it away. In 1976, they get rid of prison uniforms. So they say you have to wear prison uniforms. And Republican prisoners refused. That led to the dirty protest, right? Because they weren't allowed to walk down the prison corridors to go to the bathroom without wearing a uniform. So that hence the blanket men. So they were on the blanket, it was described as.
Yes, and this is the blanket protest, which took place over 5 years by Irish Republican political prisoners held at Longkesh prison.
Exactly. And then that escalates. 1980, first attempt at a hunger strike that's aborted. And then the second famous attempt, 1981, 10 men dead. But not before, crucially, Bobby Sands is elected to Parliament, right? And that's in response to this, again, this Thatcher policy of criminalization, right? So it's like, you're just criminals, which is related, I think, to you're just terrorists, right? This is unacceptable what you do. Your violence is unacceptable. When our British army goes around colonizing half the world, that's fine and that's lawful. But when you fight against it, you're criminals and you're terrorists. So her government was trying to run this whole argument, this whole policy of saying you're all just thugs and criminals. And Bobby Sands obliterated that. At the age of 27, he completely obliterated her claim that you have no legitimacy, you're just thugs. And he went, well, how come I'm in your parliament? And then, may he rest in peace, he succumbed to his hunger strike. So that's really interesting history. I find British people and even British comrades on the left are insufficiently conversant with that history. But we in Ireland know our history, I think, much better. And we understand that 1981 was this pivotal turning point because it led to what Sinn Féin, right, the political wing of the Provisional IRA, described as the strategy of obtaining power with the Armalite in one hand and the ballot box in the other, right? Infamous phrase. Armalite was a kind of machine gun that the IRA was fond of using. And you see something very similar in the Palestinian context, right? There's this idea that we'll win elections, but we're not going to disavow armed struggle. And like so many groups, there is a kind of non-military aspect of Hamas, and there is a military wing, right? And so thinking about history, Tony Blair comes along and sort of presents himself as this peacemaker in the north of Ireland. And I would say I'm somewhat critical of some people in the north of Ireland who still have this funny little soft spot for Tony Blair because they thank him for the Good Friday Agreement, which was in 1998, 1 year into his tenure. And so I think they're overly soft on Blair. And it's frankly a failure of international solidarity because, of course, we don't need to. It's staggeringly obvious that Blair was then responsible for horrific wars in the Middle East. He committed the crime of aggression for which war criminals were executed at Nuremberg. So this is kind of a meandering legal political history I'm offering here. But 1997, Blair's elected. 1998, Human Rights Act, Good Friday Agreement. And then 2000 is the Terrorism Act. So what's happening there? It's like he says, look, I'm gonna help to facilitate a peace treaty, Belfast Agreement or Good Friday Agreement in 1998, but then I'm going to consolidate what we found to be this very useful regime for dealing with terrorists in the north of Ireland, so-called terrorists in the north of Ireland, and I'm going to internationalize it. And then a year after that act is passed, a large number of groups get added to the list, including the military wing of Hamas. So throughout the Troubles, the British government, for all its flaws, observed a policy of saying, do you know what, we're not going to prescribe Sinn Féin. We're going to observe the distinction that the IRA tells us they observe between their military wing and their political wing. And we are going to accept that the politicians, people like Gerry Adams, are not engaged in armed struggle, but the military wing is. So it's illegal to be a member of the IRA, but it's not illegal to be a member of Sinn Féin. And I think the logic, it's clear, was that by making politicians illegal, you send a really disturbing message, right? Bobby Sands and then thereafter other people win election to your own parliament. They participate in your own so-called democratic process, but you say, we don't like who the Catholic population of the north of Ireland voted for, so we're going to make it illegal. It's just a terrible look, right? But I think partly through racism, but also partly because people winning election for the political wing of the IRA provokes a constitutional crisis in a so-called United Kingdom in a way that it doesn't in somewhere like Palestine. In 2021, Priti Patel made this astonishing decision to prescribe the political wing. So she departed from what had been this long-standing state policy in Britain of saying, well, whatever else we think of the armed wing, we're not going to prescribe the political wing. We're not going to start telling the people of Palestine that they voted for the wrong people, and so we're going to criminalize their political representatives. Like, that's a unabashed, full frontal assault on democracy. But it's not surprising, and I think it's understated in the public discourse in a country like Britain around this stuff. Obviously, Iran is part of the picture here. We all saw those Iranian missile strikes after they were forced to defend themselves against an aggressive war that the Zionist entity launched against them. It is staggering to me how British people, British politicians, the British state dares to lecture the Iranians. When you think about that country's history, you think about the way that the British Empire, again, in a staggering affront to democracy, just said, oh, you voted for Mossadegh, wrong guy. We're going to, in a staggering affront to democracy, we're just going to impose the Shah because of the Persian, what was it called? Anglo-Persian Oil Company or whatever. Literally, we are engaged in colonial plunder, and we don't like that you've elected someone who's democratically about to nationalize our oil interests. So we're, to hell with democracy. We're just going to replace him with our preferred candidate. So I don't think anyone who's paying attention expects the British Empire to care about democracy. Like, that would be ridiculous. I'm not trying to be nasty. It's silly. Like, the British Empire doesn't care about democracy.
Well, they're not silly enough in a way to believe in democracy, because they know that in order to preserve their interests, they can't rely on those interests being meaningfully changed through democratic means. So in many respects, we have a veil of democracy in many Western countries, not just Britain, but when it comes to fundamental interests and state policies, those can't meaningfully ever be changed through democratic processes.
Absolutely. It's so-called bourgeois democracy. It's not real democracy. And I'm not saying that to be like idealistic or moralistic. I'm just like, what is democracy? It's about, people having power. I would say workers having power, and workers don't have very much power at all in Britain. To the extent that we do, it's through the workplace, not through parliament. I think that there is economic democracy, which is the thing that most affects ordinary people, is power in their workplace, power over the thing that they spend most of their life doing, which is their job, right? Under capitalism, workers are coerced into selling their labor power for a wage so that they can pay for the things they need to live, like rent and food and all the rest of it. That is capitalism in a nutshell. That's the economic struggle. Hey, like, you're exploiting me. And if you paid me more, I would be more able to buy the things that I need. And then the political struggle is how these individual workplace struggles end up becoming aggregated in something like the state, right? So I have some friends who are anarchists, who are syndicalists, and I have a lot of respect and time for them, but I disagree with them because some of them would say we should just focus on the economic struggle. We should just make a big union that fights bosses, and that's our strategy. And it's all well and good, but the point is, what do you do about the state, the problem of the state? So you want to organize in a workplace, you want to go on strike. You're going to encounter laws like the Trade Union Labour Relations Consolidation Act 1992, which remains the spine, in my opinion, of the British Constitution. It is more than anything else the consolidation of neoliberal class relations and the notion that it should be extremely difficult for workers to go on strike. So I don't have easy answers. I'm just one person, but it seems to me like there's a very interesting complex relationship between the economic and the political. And that takes us to the question of what is to be done about state power, what is to be done about democracy. And in a bourgeois country like Britain, they tell us like, oh, you can choose between Labour and the Tories. And maybe if you're an idiot, you can vote for the Lib Dems and imagine that that's something other than just throwing your vote away. But if even with Jeremy Corbyn, who is, a social democrat, some kind of liberal social democrat, believes in capitalism and believes in the Labour Party, oh, no, that's too much. And then you see the deep state coming out and attacking him, the media, even generals threatening to coup him in the firing practice and stuff. So it's like the limits of democracy are laid bare. You can vote for anyone you want, so long as it's a person who believes in capitalism. But if it's someone who even believes in mild social democratic reform, like, you must not be allowed to have that. His own parliamentary party rebels against him. Everyone, every part of the deep state rebels against him. And Ralph Miliband has a really good analysis of this, where he says, like, he's thinking about Allende and all the rest of it. Like, what's your strategy? You want to achieve socialism through a bourgeois parliament? Go on then. What's your strategy? Like, you understand that the judiciary, the military, the civil service, the press, like, everything is going to rebel against you because it's the bourgeois state and it's designed to advance bourgeois class interests. So as a socialist, what's your strategy for dealing with that? And he says something about, well, you just have to constantly mobilize. You have to constantly mobilize the working class and increase their
But
participation.
people are fickle, aren't they? I mean, even Ralph Miliband, and I like early Ralph Miliband, but even, he, after writing Parliamentary Socialism, in which he savagely attacks the idea of achieving change through the Labour Party in Parliament, gets sucked into the idea of parliamentary socialism because Tony Benn, a great stalwart of the British left, becomes Minister of Technology. And apparently this is the great advance of the left. And so everyone starts saying, oh, now we have the opportunity to actually administer state power. We never thought we'd get here. Now we're here. And the same sort of thing happened with Jeremy Corbyn, right? So people spent lots of time on the left in Britain thinking we've got to organise outside of the Labour Party, outside of Parliament, to create a meaningful opposition to the status quo. But then when Jeremy Corbyn becomes Labour leader, they start saying, oh, now we have our guy as the Labour Party leader. Maybe everything we thought was wrong. Maybe we can win an election and we can have our guy as the Prime Minister. So everything that you think and know to be true just goes out of the window and you get sort of sucked into the noise. And there is this sort of, not for me actually, but there is this sort of glamour around Parliament and members of Parliament. And aren't they so brave when they stand in the House of Commons and they give this speech? Me and you obviously are not convinced by this sort of thing, but many people are, and they think that this is the most effective way to achieve power in this country, even if they have rationally thought it through. So it's difficult to sort of mobilize when you have this fickle, even wet thinking among many people who ought to know better.
I totally agree with that. And I think part of the solution is that we need to make organizations that have a clearer, sharper set of politics that we cultivate together collectively, and, a praxis, so-called, right? A theory and a practice. So we need to really engage in rigorous theoretical critique of everything, and like really try to understand reality, and then put in place a more revolutionary strategy. I absolutely agree with that. And I think partly that's about, finding spaces to embolden each other to engage in a more satisfying approach to politics. And I do think there's a very interesting complex relationship between the economic struggle and the political struggle. And you see that with these big trade unions, and then there's the struggle for democracy within trade unions, right? These so-called bureaucracies, right? The trade union bureaucracy emerges, and then it operates as this kind of check on democracy, right? And it's almost always the case that the members of a trade union and the ordinary workers in a workplace are more militant than what their trade union bureaucracy will allow. And then that creates complicated questions, because in this country, obviously, we have some smaller so-called base unions that are much more members-led. But then there's an idea that such an organization can't grow beyond a certain size if it's to be truly members-led, because at that point, a bureaucracy starts to emerge and you start to become the thing that you emerged to confront, right? So you have these massive unions, the so-called industrial unions, Unison, Unite, so on. But they're extremely bureaucratic. And coming back to Palestine, they've mostly been pretty terrible on Palestine, right? So no easy answers for you, but it does seem as though remaining grounded in the economic struggle and thinking about what some people call economic democracy, right? The idea that more than anything, people should have control over their workplaces. And when you think about voting, this very bourgeois understanding of democracy that every 5 years you get to have a vote for which shade of capitalist is going to dominate you. Like, the far more important vote that ordinary people can make in their lives is a vote to go on strike. Like, and you see it. I've been involved in, contributing to strike campaigns, and it's incredible to see the transformation in people whenever they realize, like, what, we can vote to withdraw our labor, and if we do, we will gain control of our workplaces. It's stunning.
Although this is entry level stuff, I should also say, I mean, people engaging in trade unions is one thing, but that isn't, I would say, the real struggle. Not to get too parochial or bogged down in Marxist theory, but if we're analyzing that terrain, Lenin, of course, talked about the limits of the economic struggle and trade unions, saying that that was a limited form of consciousness that working people could reach of their own volition. And in the workplaces, that's been diminished to a great degree since Lenin was talking anyway, because trade unions have been smashed across Western countries and the wider world, notwithstanding the great power that they still do have in many places, of course. But there has to be a broader consciousness building through engagement with theory and also the practical application of that theory when the opportunity arises. I mean, we often hear about the shock doctrine, which is used to implement neoliberalism. Well, I think we need our own shock doctrine. We're not as effective as other political actors in taking advantage of crises to implement our politics. I don't think we've done that as effectively as we should have been doing for almost 2 years of genocide in Gaza.
That's absolutely correct. And it's a sign of how weak the left is. And I was talking about this earlier. The international brigades, right, used to be, and there's a very interesting history of the Spanish Civil War, but broadly it's clear that there was a fight against fascism, and the left sent a load of people to join the fight against fascism. And you compare that to Gaza, like, it's absolutely a fight against fascism. Like, whatever else people might have wanted Zionism to become, it's clear that it's become fascist. If it wasn't, some people would say it was always fascist, but certainly it's undeniably fascist now. You have government ministers like Smotrich just openly saying, yes, I'm a fascist. And where is the left? And that's not there's a risk of that becoming this moral chastising, chiding, like, oh, why is the left not better? Like, that's voluntarism, right? I'm not here to say we should be better, we should be stronger. It's like, we're not strong, we're weak. And we should admit that. The left in the so-called West, in the global North, and in developed countries is extremely weak. You're right to say that in this country it was smashed. The miners' strike is perhaps the most obvious example of that, right? One of the most militant trade unions in the country was violently attacked by police forces that Thatcher bussed in from around the country to physically confront organized labor, and she won. And then her government consolidated that victory in the form of the 1992.
Well, that example you mentioned there about the Battle of Orgreave, and there were many other examples, not just that one, of the British police violently attacking striking miners during the miners' strike of the 1980s. It relates to a question I wanted to ask, which is that if the concept of terrorism started with this idea that the state has a monopoly on violence, we're now in a position where the state has gained a monopoly on what is legitimate political expression. And so in many ways, you could say, well, they've always had that. The miners' strike obviously is a great example of how when people are engaging in a form of protest, which is what striking is, it's a form of protest in order to achieve a particular demand, they were then obviously violently attacked. But we've now seen non-violent political activity, in the case of the proscription of Palestine Action, come under the purview of terrorism. So surely that's a clear example of the whole terrorism apparatus being completely fallacious. I mean, can you speak about broadly what this means? Because obviously this is an escalation. It's the first time since the Terrorism Act 2000 came about that a non-violent direct action group has been prescribed. And of course, there's now a judicial review, which is a type of legal process that's been brought against the British government to try to overturn that ban. I appreciate that you're not directly involved in that judicial review, but could you explain what that's about? Because this is a live issue that people should be continuing to campaign on.
Yeah, I have a few thoughts on this. So I think that the British state looks incredibly weak right now. It is, of course, responsible. The British Empire passed the Balfour Declaration, presided over the colonial Palestine Mandate, used its control of that mandate to facilitate the emergence of a so-called Jewish state, and is therefore more than any other state responsible for the emergence of the Zionist entity and the ongoing project of ethnically cleansing Palestine, right? And it's worth noting that it was British imperialists who first fantasized about this idea of a Jewish state, right? And I've talked before about Andreas Malm's pamphlet, The Destruction of Palestine is the Destruction of the Earth, very thoughtful analysis. And he talks about 1840, right? 1840, the British Navy was bombing Acre on the Mediterranean coast. And so it's almost 200 years as the Brits fantasizing about having a little loyal Jewish Ulster, right? That's Ronald Storr's infamous phrase, right? When he was the colonial governor of Jerusalem. And so the British state has always been committed to Zionism, and it derives a certain degree of military, diplomatic, and sort of strategic benefit from having this unsinkable aircraft carrier. The baton has very much passed to the Yanks now. Like, it went through the French. There was an interesting period. The French obviously helped the Zionist entity to develop a nuclear bomb. And then I think around about the 70s, it sort of passes to the US being the main broker of the Zionist entity. And so it seems clear that, you know, so-called Israel can't really survive without a proper, you know, what's sometimes called great power backer, right? They need a really powerful imperialist metropole to support them, without which they wouldn't survive. And you see that from even just this war on Iran, right? They start a war on Iran, an aggressive war on Iran. And then Iran says, you know, we're the biggest regional hegemon, really, and we've got a lot of ballistic missiles. In a war of attrition, we've got 90 million people, and you've got, what, like less than a tenth of that. And we all saw it. We all saw Israel getting hammered by these missiles slamming into Tel Aviv and Haifa, and it took the US intervening to save Israel. So everyone saw it. It's like, if there were any illusions about it now, Iran was like, in a straight-up conflict between Israel and Iran, Iran wins, absent nuclear weapons, which is an interesting
But even if that had gone on longer, that would have only further evidenced the point. I mean, some critics were saying, oh, Iran is firing all of these ballistic missiles and so many of them are being shot down, even though many of them did hit and caused extensive damage in Tel Aviv and Haifa. And in order to stop those missiles over those 12 days, Israel and the US had to expend so much money, so many missiles to take down the Iranian ones. In fact, you had, I think it was about 150 US THAAD missiles being expended. That's 25% of the United States' entire stock, such that the Pentagon was getting worried about the US's ability to defend itself if something kicked off with China. And those 150 THAAD missiles will cost something like $2 billion to replace over at least 1 year of rebuilding. And then even Israel's own long-range air defense system can also be depleted. So eventually it would have come to the point that Iran would have won in that sort of war of attrition. But I apologize because I interrupted you on a very important point about nuclear weapons.
Well, I want to answer your question, which was about, you know, Palestine action and what does it tell us about the course of terrorism. But so I was trying to make the point that, look, the British state is really invested in this, and then I sort of made a side point about how Britain's little loyal Jewish Ulster, like, is a colonial project. It's an advancement of initially British imperial and now sort of NATO, US imperial power in the region. It's primarily a military function, that's my understanding, but it does have some interesting economic functions as well, right? And it needs a great power backer to function. And Britain backs it, and British foreign policy seems to be entirely subservient to American foreign policy. You saw that with the Iraq War, and you see that now, right? And so the crisis of Zionism is a crisis for British imperial hegemony and US imperial hegemony, right? And so that's why our enemies are on the back foot, in my opinion, right? Zionism is in a crisis. We can talk about why, but it just seems very obvious to me, right? Even liberals must accept that, right? ICC arrest warrants. You have to arrest the prime minister of one of your closest allies if he comes to your own territory. The ICJ is about to determine whether or not you're genocidal, has already determined that you're an apartheid state. Like, even within the extremely colonial, racist, problematic terrain of international law, the conclusions of those courts are like, yeah, even we have to admit, like, this is too much, right? So crisis of Zionism is a crisis of British imperial hegemony. They're like, we're losing control of this narrative. We're losing control over our ability to project power into the Middle East. And I think the factor that's often understated, I mean, you mentioned China, but I don't think a lot of the mainstream discourse talks about China because it's almost like this taboo. Like, China is becoming extremely powerful. It's not wasting loads of its men and women, like its soldiers and its military resources, on obnoxious, fruitless, horrific wars like Ukraine. And it's certainly not participating in a genocide and thereby obliterating its own standing in the international community. It's not chewing its way through international law and just tearing up the so-called international rules-based order in pursuit of like Jewish nationalism, like Jewish ethno-nationalism and genocide. So China's waiting in the wings to be like, all right, go ahead. Like China's frankly laughing, just like, wow, why are you doing this? And the answer is that it's a crisis. The crisis of Zionism is a crisis of US global hegemony. And that crisis, of course, has an effect on Britain, which is a subordinate ally of the United States. And so, let's empathize with our enemies for a moment. What is the British state to do when faced with this sheer scale of public anger at Britain's active participation in this genocide? What is to be done about that? There's this great Pashakanist quote that I'm fond of, where he talks about, Pashakanist, the Soviet legal theorist who wrote a very interesting book called The General Theory of Law and Marxism. And I encourage all, critical lawyers to read that book. Very thoughtful critique of, what is law, what is the state, all the rest of it. And in the introduction to the English translation of that book that I've got, he says something about how there comes a time when any set of social relations enters into a crisis. And so it's not able to cloak itself behind these mystificatory ideological constructs, right? So Zionism had this very powerful ideology that insulated it from criticism, right? If you criticize the Jewish state, then you hate Jews, and this is the only way for Jews to be safe in the wake of the Holocaust, and all this kind of stuff that was designed to distract attention from the fact that it was a colonial project. It was arguably fascist, certainly ethno-nationalist, and it was premised upon the mass murder and deliberate ethnic cleansing of non-Jewish Palestinians, because Zionism construes them as a racial threat to the desired purity, right? The demographic racial purity of an ethno-state, right? So this disgusting, overtly violent, overtly colonial racist project insulates itself by reference to these very sophisticated, emotional appeals about the Holocaust and the need to defend Jews. That's all breaking down. And everyone's like, what? So just so we're clear, because the horrific violence of the Holocaust happens, that means that we need to have endless violence, not just against Palestinians because they're the wrong race, but also against all of Israel's neighbors and even countries as far away as Iran. And everyone can just say, no, this is insane, actually. And so it's like the veil is totally slipped. Zionism is in terminal crisis, I think. I think it's melting down. I don't think it's going to survive this. And so the British state is trying. I really think our enemies are on the back foot. And I'm not trying to downplay the horrific cost to Palestinians. It is truly horrific. I can't even really imagine it. I think it will take time as the human family for us to really psychologically, emotionally reckon with the sheer scale of the ongoing slaughter that's happening while you and I are speaking. It's like we're all completely changed by it. It's horrific. I feel emotional even just talking about it. It's almost like you have to compartmentalize to keep functioning. It's just so horrific what we're witnessing, right? And it's the sheer impunity of it, I think, that's really staggering. Like the Zionist, the specifically Jewish Israeli Zionist mentality, the self-victimization, the narcissism, the belief that Jewish trauma is the only thing that matters, and that it can justify the most horrific, open dehumanization of Palestinians. Like it's a staggering affront to all of our humanity, and not to overstate it, but part of the silver lining of the fact that Zionism seems to be dying is that we have to. Part of that is to try and rehabilitate. This is idea. There's an analogy with the denazification process that happened in Germany. I appreciate that will be regarded as incendiary, but it's a necessary.
I do think, though, to be honest, that's overstated, because whilst you had the Nuremberg trials, you also had Operation Paperclip. You also had
don't get me wrong,
integration of Nazis into
I was just in Berlin. Like they have not denazified. It's horrific. The violence of the German police in Berlin is staggering. I'm not here to endorse the Metropolitan Police, but like by contrast, I mean, partly that's a function of the fact that the marches in London are so big that the Met are just like, we must not antagonize this movement because it is too big and we can't control it. And you can see that with that funny little interaction between Suella Braverman and the chief of the Met Police, where she was like, we need to ban this march because they're going to disrupt our war dead or whatever. And the chief of the Met was like, you can't do that. Not just as a matter of law. You could see that it was like, if you start trying to ban marches, you're going to have a problem. It's going to drive people into the arms of Palestine Action. Now, look, I appreciate I'm giving you a very meandering answer. You asked me about Palestine Action, and I've sort of talked about everything, but I am coming to that. The short answer is Zionism is in crisis. That creates a problem for the US and for Britain, and Britain is decidedly on the back foot on this issue. And so the British government has tried to stem the tide, but it keeps coming up against this Streisand effect, right? So you see it with kneecap, which again, same act, terrorism act, right? Like your man is alleged to have run around on stage with a Hezbollah flag, Liam Oak. And they're like, okay, we're going to prosecute you now. And it's like, why did you do that? He's a folk hero now. You turned him into like this, you immortalized him. He will forever be this guy who did this during, like, you know, allegedly did this thing during a genocide. They made a hero out of him. Idiots, right? Massive mistake. Same with Pal Action. They're like, oh, are we going to look really stupid if we do this? Like, can we do this? Can we just prescribe them as terrorists? And everyone's like, really? Like, so I think it's a mistake. I'm not trying to be smug or complacent, but you can just see by the way that it's been received.
Well, people are outraged, and even others who you might not expect, like liberals and even conservatives, have voiced unease at the decision to ban Palestine Action. But could you talk a bit about the legal process that's now happening? Because you had this situation where an application for judicial review was brought against the British government by Huda Amori, who co-founded Palestine Action. And Mr. Justice Chamberlain gave permission for that application. And what that means is that the judicial review can now go ahead for the benefit of our viewers and listeners. But there was also this application for interim relief, which would have meant that in the meantime, while the judicial review process goes ahead, the ban on Palestine Action would have been temporarily lifted. But he didn't grant that interim relief.
I'm very disappointed that he didn't have the, I would say, courage to grant interim relief. It is interesting that the Court of Appeal, out of hours, was robed up and ready to go. So even if he had done the right thing and said, you know what, this is really disturbing, this attempt to, this order prescribing Palestine Action is a staggering affront to civil liberties, and I do have serious concerns about it, I'm granting interim relief. So the order will not come into effect until such time as we've heard a proper legal challenge. The Court of Appeal was there, and it's clear the Court of Appeal was not there to challenge his decision to refuse interim relief. The Court of Appeal was there ready to correct any decision that he might have made to grant interim relief. That's my read on it, right? But to come back to this Streisand effect thing, you saw this group in Scotland, Stop Leonardo, springing up. So the Streisand effect is already happening.
Could you just explain what you mean by the Streisand effect?
So obviously the Streisand effect is Barbara Streisand had a home on the beachfront or something, and she didn't want people to know about it. And so she tried to have a photo taken down, and it had the opposite effect. Once it became apparent she was trying to hide something, everyone wanted to know what she was hiding, and so the photo went viral.
You see this all the time when people try to ban a book or ban a film or ban a song, then people intrinsically, because of human nature, want to know about it more. Or you're trying to keep something from me. Now I want to know about it. You're trying to stop me from doing something. Now I want to participate in it. And of course, it should also be clarified, the fact that they've prescribed Palestine Action doesn't mean that they've prescribed direct action as a tactic. Obviously, people who engage in direct action do so at their own risk. If they're doing something like criminal damage or something that's potentially unlawful, they obviously run the risk of potentially being prosecuted for that. But they're not necessarily going to be prosecuted for being terrorists because they've gone and done something akin to what Palestine Action was doing before.
So I do think, again, forgive me if I'm being overly playful and meandering, but I find it really interesting thinking these things through with you, right? And I think, we were talking about the crisis of Zionism and how that registers as a crisis of British imperial hegemony. And I do think, putting my lawyer hat on for a moment, I do think it's necessary to go into court and to name this crisis in open court. Just say the British state is participating actively in this genocide. The British state has, for almost 2 centuries, been deeply committed to this bizarre racist fantasy of a little loyal Jewish Ulster. That fantasy is based in no small part on British imperial anti-Semitism. Like, all of this stuff is very, very easy to go into court and say if you have the right politics, the right client, and it's happening at the right moment, right? And this is something I said when I was in Berlin recently talking to the comrades there, and they have it even worse than us, if you can imagine. I was sort of saying that there's this guy, Jacques Vergès, that I'm fond of quoting, and I owe thanks to my friend Rob Knox, who introduced me to that thinker, right? He was a lawyer practicing in French-occupied Algeria and pioneered this idea of a strategic distinction between connivance and rupture. And you can't just go into court and wish that there was a ruptural moment. There has to be a mass movement. And then because there's a mass movement, that empowers you to go into court and just say, like, you and whose army? Like, your court doesn't have the power to stop us. And that was what was happening with the FLN, right? The FLN people being charged with these terrorism offenses, there's that word again. And Vergès was going in with their, instructions, and they would pioneer this strategy together according to which they would just go in and say, we're the FLN, like we have a mass movement outside and we're committed to driving your state, the French state, out of our country. We don't recognize your court. And once you get to a certain level of militancy, you can do that. And I'm not saying we're quite at FLN levels, but we are at the stage where, it looks like, even just with this new Corbyn party, these genocide MPs, the sorts of MPs who have administered this genocide, the sorts of MPs who voted for the proscription of Palestine Action, they're going to get wiped out at the next election. Like, I certainly hope they do. And it already almost happened in 2024, right? You have these Gaza independents, very difficult to win an independent political parliamentary campaign in a first past the post system, and yet 4 people did. Corbyn, of course, won his seat. Liane Mohammed came within 500 votes of depriving West Streeting of his seat. Like, it's going to be a bloodbath. They're going to get wiped out, right? So that's the crisis. And Palestine Action is one of the most obvious symptoms of it. We need to keep up the pressure. We need to keep saying, we need to keep escalating. It's a genocide. It's beyond urgent. But in my opinion, the British state, because it's in such a crisis, because it's on the back foot, because the social relations on which Zionism were built, according to Patrick Canis, have now become completely visible. And so the Zionist project is no longer capable of defending itself from the theoretical blows directed at it, but also the physical blows. It couldn't defend itself against October 7th, and it can't defend itself against those Iranian missile strikes. So I think the best defense is always a good offense. And any lawyers listening to this, or any people going into court having to defend themselves in cases relating to Palestine, should simply go in and calmly, without moral judgment, dispassionately, because that's the style that the British state and its courts prefer. You just go in and you just say, who cares what the British Empire thinks? You're participating in this genocide. You may retain some legal authority because I'm in your court, but your moral authority has collapsed. Your political authority has collapsed. And I personally don't recognize what you have to tell me about my alleged wrongdoing and my racism. I did a tweet, or I smashed up an arms factory, nonviolent direct action against property. I didn't murder any Palestinian children, did I? I didn't run spy flights over a little loyal Jewish Ulster while the rabid, fanatical fascists engage in mass murder and genocide. You did all that? You, the British state, are doing that? I don't care what you think. I'll listen to what you say and I'll engage with it critically, but you have no authority to judge me. There reaches a moment when you're able to provoke that kind of a rupture in court. And in my opinion, that's the moment we've reached. And I'll give you just one example. I've been representing a lot of professionals recently, right? Solicitors, barristers, doctors, in front of their respective professional regulators, right? So it's a prosecution, but it's a non-criminal regulatory prosecution aimed at punishing professionals for alleged wrongdoing or transgression of their professional duties and obligations. And in most of those cases, the regulator seems to prefer pursuing, strike off, like depriving these professionals of their right to practice. There's a well-publicized case involving Ghassan Abu Sitta, like absolute hero, British Palestinian doctor who went to save people's lives in the middle of a genocide, put himself at great risk, lived through literal war crimes while the Zionist fascists were attacking hospitals he was working at, and yet he was dragged in front of his regulator. Those kinds of cases are what I'm talking about. And so some of the professionals I've been representing, we have now reached a point where you just go in and you say, well, hold on a second. My guy did some tweets or whatever, or did a Facebook post, or said something you don't like. You're part of the British state. Like, you're engaged in the mass murder of Palestinian children right now, aren't you? Like, who cares what you think about racism? And you literally say this, like, obviously perhaps not quite that tone, but you do broadly say, you say, look, and I said it to a judge just this week. I was like, I rely on this panel to be impartial and to look at this objectively, but I have concerns, sir, judge, whatever it might be, because the elephant in the room is that the British state's not neutral on this. The British state is deeply committed to the racist project of mass murder that we call Zionism. It's a colonial empire that's one of the most violently racist institutions in human history, and it's currently participating in a genocide against Palestinians. In my opinion, we've reached a point where it's perfectly possible to go into court and say that sort of stuff. And that's the winning strategy.
I agree, but it's also quite tedious to have to keep doing this over and over again, because this is an example of Zionist lawfare. And before I get on to how you've been personally attacked, I think it's worth spelling out, in my experience of working with the Left Legal Fighting Fund, how Zionist lawfare works. So in terms of the work that I've done, I've helped to support employees who have posted something about Israel on social media, and then they've been targeted by their employers. And we've been highly successful in many cases of stopping people being disciplined, stopping them being fired from their jobs. But for the Zionists, this is all a very low cost endeavor, and it's a very parasitic way of operating where effectively Zionists occupy or harass institutions and spread their malign influence to get them to do their bidding. So, a classic example of that would be when the Equality and Human Rights Commission in Britain launched an investigation into the Corbyn led Labour Party for supposed anti Semitism. That investigation was triggered by two pro Israel groups, the so called Campaign Against Anti Semitism and the self styled Jewish Labour Movement. Now, the bulk of that work and expense was carried out by the Equality and Human Rights Commission, not by the CAA, the Campaign Against Anti Semitism, or the Jewish Labour Movement. So, those two Zionist organizations effectively outsourced all the work to a different body. And again, when it comes to employers or media organizations or political parties or professional regulators, whatever the case may be, they do all of the heavy lifting against anti Zionists after receiving pressure from Zionist groups like the CAA or UK Lawyers for Israel. So these Zionist groups don't have to do too much work. And then we have to do lots of work to fight back against them. And that has actually backfired as well, of course, and that's resulted in some crushing defeats for them, like in Professor David Miller's employment tribunal case. But it's still quite tedious. And then in your case, the Campaign Against Anti-Semitism complained against you to your professional regulator because you talked about Israel being an apartheid state. This was back in 2021. So can you talk a bit about that and what we can do to counter that? Because it seems like we're playing whack-a-mole.
Absolutely. Very interesting question. I mean, you're basically talking about strategy. What's the best strategy for dismantling Zionism? In my opinion, broadly, at the risk of being too pithy or oversimplifying, I think that lawyers should be talking with their clients. And if their clients so instruct, we should be going into court and doing maximum damage to Zionism, finding ways to do that, right? Now, I suppose I have a few things to say. First of all, maybe three things. The first is like to think about this, what do we mean when we talk about Zionism and the British state being Zionist or there being Zionist organizations? The second is to talk about this idea of defensive versus offensive strategy and the relationship between politics and law. And then I suppose the third is to talk specifically about some of the concrete tasks that I think we could be undertaking pursuant to an offensive strategy, which in my opinion is the correct strategy, right? So the first of those, you're obviously right to talk about Zionist organizations like CAA, Campaign Against Anti-Semitism, so-called, and the UK Lawyers for Israel. So they're these very, very explicitly Zionist organizations. And their strategy has been moderately successful. I don't disagree with you. But really, I think, in some ways, what's more sinister is, and more difficult to confront, I mean, they're kind of racist idiots. Like, a lot of them are, like, just not very good lawyers. And like you said, I'm going to start naming names, I suppose that's to be avoided. But, certain barristers will remain nameless. I just don't think that they're very critical. They're these kind of smooth-brained liberals who are just drinking the Kool-Aid, right? And they're just like, oh, Zionism is very good, and Palestinians are all evil terrorists, and they're just not very critical people. I don't find their defense of their racist positions even particularly interesting or sophisticated. I just think they're kind of smug members of the British establishment who are complacent, right? The British establishment itself, sort of bits of it that are a bit more hidden, the bits of it that are a bit more sophisticated, the deep state, as it's sometimes called, like it is committed to Zionism, right? And coming back to Malm, right, he has this section in that pamphlet I mentioned called Against the Lobby Theory, where he sort of says, like, it's not that Israel and its lobby is controlling countries like the United States and Britain. It's dialectical, but it's the other way around, right? Like, Malm quotes Nasrallah saying the Zionist entity would collapse were it not for US support, right?
Well, to be honest, I have a slight disagreement here, and I think it's important to distinguish a few things. So I think absolutely the Zionist regime couldn't possibly exist with all the forces ranged against it if it didn't have the backing, funding, missiles, air defense of the United States of America and other Western countries. But at the same time, it's not exactly just a stooge of the US. I mean, some people very strongly say Israel is controlled by the United States. It simply does the bidding of Western imperialism. Others say no, it's Israel that controls the US, Britain, and other countries. I think the truth is a bit more complicated than both of those positions. Obviously, Britain and the US have interests that are pursued in West Asia through this colonial entity. It's an unsinkable aircraft carrier, it's a springboard into the region. Absolutely. At the same time, there has been a reversing of that process where Zionists have occupied and colonized British, US, and other Western countries' interests precisely because those interests have been planted there by Zionists through concerted state capture and infiltration.
I think that's interesting. I certainly think it's complex, but I think that if you think about where Zionism comes from, it comes from Britain, right? And I think that's what Malm shows, and others have shown it better than him. I don't think he claims to be an expert on this.
I think things can change over time as well, and I don't think it's correct to say Zionism is essentially a British project. It has a long history before that, but by the time you get to Theodor Herzl, he's lobbying Britain after failing to convince the Ottoman Empire to say, well, look, this Jewish state in Palestine could be your route to India. This will serve your interests. This is a colonial project. And Britain gets very invested in that. But then at the same time, how can you explain the campaign of Zionist terrorism in the 1930s and 40s against Britain? So it's complex. And I don't think it's either or personally. And I think the evidence for that is, if you just look at the case of Britain, the two biggest lobbying groups, of which most MPs are a part, are either conservative Friends of Israel or Labour Friends of Israel. And of course, you have many other Israel lobby and Zionist groups as well. So why is there this huge lobbying effort by Israel in Britain and the United States and other Western countries? That happens precisely to ensure that those members of parliament, those congressmen, those senators, and those representatives are whipped into supporting the Zionist state. Now, until very recently, if you were a member of parliament in Britain who opposed Israel in any way, shape, or form, you were completely marginalized. So, in many ways, to get on in British and US public life, you have to almost swear loyalty to Israel. Now, is that necessarily in Britain's and the United States' interests?
Yeah, we can't engage in this simplistic, Israel, the so-called state of Israel has no agency. Clearly it does. It's a nation state. It can engage in its own policies. So, yeah, I don't want to get bogged down in that too much. I just think that my point is that when you talk about campaigning against anti-Semitism, making submissions to the EHRC, and then getting the British state, a part of the British state, a Blairite institution, obviously, to investigate the Corbyn-led Labour Party. There's a whole load of moving parts there. Partly it's an attack on the left, right? It's a convenient attack to be we're going to use anti-Semitism, malicious allegations, mostly thereof, to attack the left. But also, why is that attack met with such a receptive? Why does it fall on such fertile soil when it's made to these various British state institutions? Because British state institutions are yeah, we agree with you. We're Zionist. We agree with there being this insane, ethno-state that ethnically cleanses Palestine. We agree with all of that. And that's why we're so receptive to your submissions. Now, as the left, we could try to do this kind of, I'd like to speak to the manager strategy, which is basically campaign against anti-Semitism and UKLFI in a nutshell. They're just I'm outraged. I want to speak to the police, or I want to speak to a regulator. They're just curtain twitching little dweebs. That's their whole strategy. We could adopt that strategy. I think it's pathetic. Where I come from, snitches get stitches, and we don't complain like that. I want to speak to the manager. So we can mock them for being such so pathetic and just constantly appealing to the authority of the British Empire. I don't recognize that authority. I'm not going to go to the British Empire and be because they just won't be receptive to my politics, right? That's the point. Tony Blair committed war crimes. Everyone knows that. It's not even a secret. It's just obvious. He committed the crime of aggression. We could go to the police. People have tried. He destroyed an entire country. Can you just arrest him or even just investigate him? And the British state is no, this is fine. We're going to allow this. Same with Starmer. Starmer did war crimes on camera. He's participating in a genocide. We can all see it happening. Anyone who's paying attention, you and I were talking about Matt Kennard earlier. Brilliant investigative journalism. Not difficult to do, to be fair to him. He's just it's not hard to show that the British state, with its military bases in Cyprus, that are running these surveillance flights during a genocide, sending military parts, diplomatic aid, all the rest of it. It's not hard to show that Keir Starmer is guilty, complicit, participating in the genocide. But if we make similar submissions to parts of the British state, be it the police or whoever it might be, they're just going to be really unreceptive to it. They're oh, no, but we like this. We're the British Empire. We do colonial violence. That's fine. So that's part of the picture. Our strategy can't be to just reproduce the stupid right-wing Zionist strategy, because they're on different terrain, and they go to their home terrain, which is the courts of this country, the institutions of this country, and say, oh, more sophisticated, less openly Zionist organizations, please can you help us to attack our anti-Zionist enemies in the Labour Party and all the rest of it, right? So that's point one. Point two is this point I was going to make about law and politics and offense versus defense, right? I find it very frustrating. I think it's partly a British left thing. I think even places like Derry have been better, right? I think we saw that Derry Council, the local authority, after Palestine Action was banned, they just put in some astonishing motion, just being like, I don't know the exact terms of it, but basically it came perilously close to just flagrantly denying the terms of the Terrorism Act, right? We're Derry. This is where Bloody Sunday happened. We don't think your colonial empire should even be here. We don't care about your laws. They don't represent us. As the democratically locally elected body of your so-called government, we don't recognize this ban, right? So there are parts of in Ireland where the instincts and the political approach to terrorism is much sharper, because there is still a living memory, very, very recent living memory of being attacked by very, very similar terrorism powers, right? But on the British left, there is this defensiveness that I find frustrating. And I think we should overcome it together. We should go on the offensive, because when we do, we win. And it's like I've said, that wasn't true before this genocide. I think that we were really on the back foot, and Zionism remained extremely hegemonic, and it was used to savagely attack Corbynism and basically defeat Corbynism, all the rest of it. But we're not there anymore. 22 months of mass murder has fundamentally changed people's consciousness. I saw polling saying 4-1 people in Britain favor Israel being expelled from the United Nations. Like, that's stunning. It's a stunning reversal, right? So we should go on the offensive, and the reason the British state is not going on the offensive comes back to what we said about democracy, right? If this place was a democracy where people had power, we wouldn't be participating in a genocide. We would be opposing it. We would be cutting off aid. We would be imposing sanctions. We would be calling for the Zionist entity to be expelled from the UN. We would be calling for Tzipi Hatolvi, the fascist ambassador, to be expelled from the country. Like, if we had democracy, it wouldn't be difficult to be in solidarity with the Palestinians. So offensive strategies win. And then there's this relationship between law and politics. And part of the problem we have with specifically legal aspects of the struggle is that when very, very militant comrades go into court, like, because their strategy has clashed with a court for some reason, maybe they're having to defend themselves in a criminal trial, maybe they're trying to go on some militant strike and the bosses have gone to the high court to try and get an injunction, whatever it might be, your militant prior political strategy clashes with a court for some reason, you find yourself needing to rely on the services of a lawyer. And one of the big problems we have in this country is a lack of, call it movement lawyers, call it comrades, people with proper sharp politics who are willing to keep pace with the militancy of their clients. And I've taken to sort of describing it as this difference between option A and option B, right? You go to any liberal lawyer and say, what are my options? They'll say, yeah, option A, just do this. This is the nice liberal option. This is what liberals would expect. This is what coheres, is consonant with liberal ideology and politics and assumptions. Option B is this kind of ruptural, risky thing that a liberal lawyer just mostly won't even think. They just won't think to do it, right? Go into court and speak Irish. A liberal lawyer just wouldn't think that. Like, oh, go into court and speak Irish, and in Irish say, we don't recognize the jurisdiction of your court because it's colonial and we're an anti-colonial resistance movement. Like, a liberal is never going to advise that you do that. You need someone with some political bite to be like, okay, you want to take option B, very, very risky. Here are the risks. Here are the rewards. Let's think it through together, right? Informed consent, but you could do option B if you wanted to, right? So we have a lack of lawyers willing to talk about option B.
Why is that, do you think? I mean, is it just the case that the English bar is very much like a club? You know, it's hard for people to get inside that club if they have a very different perspective? Or is it just that people are conditioned as lawyers to think solely in lawyerly terms and that they don't have the political education to think outside the box, think of alternative strategies and alternative routes? What's the real sort of issue behind all that?
There's lots of reasons, but the short, pithy answer is to say a lack of organization. Like, it's on us. The left is extremely weak in this country and it's disorganized. And that means that, just concretely, I think, and based kind of on anecdote and instinct, having spent, the better part of a decade or more knocking around the legal sector, I have this impression that some comrades come up through the ranks, come through law school, get qualified, they have decent politics, decent instincts, they get into law for the right reasons. I want to help the movement, and the world seems like it's a bit messed up, and I want to contribute to the left-wing project of transforming it for the better. And then they get sucked into quite a conservative profession, small c, very conservative ways of thinking, very deferential to Parliament. And then they come to imagine that because they're on the left wing of the legal profession, that still qualifies as them as being on the radical left. So I think the winning strategy is one that subordinates legal tactics to a prior political strategy. And what all too often happens is the lawyers try to impose their liberal tactics on a much more militant client, so-called, right? And I don't think I'm being insincere or too playful when I say that we are all lawyers. Like, I really mean that, right? Like, what is a lawyer? A lawyer interprets the law. A working class kid in London who's walking through his estate with a bit of weed in his pocket or something and sees a cop, like, that man is a lawyer in that moment. He's like, oh, I know the law. Like, I know that he can use violence against me. I know that the substance I'm carrying is a controlled substance and that I'm allegedly committing a crime by possessing it. Like, we're all out here interpreting the bourgeois laws that are dominating us. And so rather than what tends to happen, very, very militant comrades going to approach lawyers, and then the lawyer says, I'm the lawyer and I'm here to tell you what you should do, and I'm here to tell you what you can and can't do. What we need is to create a cadre of comrade lawyers who are like, I'm not here to tell you what to do. Like, you're the comrade who's pursuing this amazing strategy. I'm here to help facilitate. What do you want? What's your preferred outcome?
I have to say, I have found this a lot, actually, working with many solicitors and barristers, helping people to take legal cases. It often seems like we're fighting against the lawyers to try to convince them to adopt a particular strategy that's, for want of a better word, more militant, more aggressive, that keeps pace with the opposition, because the opposition have absolutely no compunction at all about saying things in a very declaratory way, things about anti-Semitism, Zionism, what these things mean. They'll just say it in a very declaratory, matter-of-fact way, as if that's just received wisdom. And then our side will respond to that by kind of conceding the point to them, rather than saying, no, actually, that's a load of nonsense.
Yep. And you're talking about offensive strategies. And maybe that allows me to segue into my third point. But like broadly, straddling the divide between point 2 and point 3, right? What's the right strategy? So the 2 points I'm making are, number one, your legal strategy needs to be subordinate to your political strategy. And if you get it the other way around, you've already lost, because you're fighting on the terrain of your enemies, right? The ruling class writes the rules. The bourgeois state writes the laws. Why would you choose that as your terrain? You need to go onto that terrain and recognize it's hostile terrain. We still go here, but we have to go pursuant to it. And Rob Knox is brilliant on this. His essay, Strategy and Tactics, is a brilliant critique of people who claim to be militant, intervening in the terrain of law and just completely, at the first hurdle, capitulating to liberal legal notions that we should be aiming to completely abolish, right? So that's point 1. And then point 2 is that we should be on the offensive, not the defensive. And that's what you're talking about, right? Our enemies are always on the offensive. They're like, we're the bourgeois state. We love Zionism, love a bit of colonialism. Go into court and be like, that's all fine, actually. We should go into court and be like, no, that's insane racism. And like, the British state is participating in a genocide, has no moral legitimacy. Like, we should go into court and just say all that stuff, right? Concretely, I'm hopefully about to release an article, which I've been working on for some time with some comrades, called Zionism is not worthy of respect, right? We should go into court and just make that argument. Fifth limb of Granger's. So stop me if I get into the weeds too much. I'll try to.
Well, what's Granger? What does worthy of respect mean? As I understand it, this is mainly in the employment tribunal.
Well, it's strictly, it's beyond that, right? It's philosophical belief. The Equality Act sort of says, don't fire someone because they're black, don't refuse someone a promotion because they're a woman. And then it also says, don't discriminate because of belief. And that raises this tricky question of, well, what kind of belief qualifies for protection? Obviously, there has to be some kind of threshold. It can't be that just like, I love rice pudding. Like, that's not enough. And also, what would it even mean for you to have been fired? So there's a process for determining when will the belief be worthy of respect. And there's a very authoritative case called Granger, which sets down this 5-stage test for determining when will the belief be worthy of respect in a given case on a given set of facts. And this is obviously what was being argued in David Miller's case. His beliefs in anti-Zionism and his belief that Zionism was a racist project that should be opposed were held to be worthy of respect in a democratic society, which is the fifth limb, right? The belief must be worthy of respect in a democratic society and not incompatible with the rights of others. In my opinion, it's extremely easy now to go into court and just say, well, Zionism doesn't satisfy those criteria. It's not worthy of respect. And then, again, the European Convention on Human Rights is relevant here because your right not to be discriminated against because of a philosophical belief under the Equality Act overlaps entirely with your right under Article 9 to manifest your beliefs, right? And so all the European Convention case law comes in, and that's where this Article 17 stuff comes from. That's what Granger was saying, was Article 17 of the Convention broadly says, don't use the rights that you have under the Convention to attack and fundamentally deny other people's rights. And so it's like, look, don't, it's basically a kind of anti-Nazi defense, right? It's like, don't, like, if Nazis start trying to use the convention to obliterate other people's rights and say things like all Jews need to be rounded up and killed, then you lose the protection of the convention in those circumstances. That's what Article 17 is about. In my opinion, it's not difficult to go into court and just say Zionism should lose the protection of the convention. Like, it's a fascist belief. Even if you disagree with that, it's certainly a racist belief. And then again, like, I'm no liberal, but these liberal judgments are quite helpful. You go into court with an ICJ advisory opinion from last year saying they're in breach of Article 3 of the Convention on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination, and that means that they're engaged in racial segregation and apartheid, and you just go in and say the official ideology of the state that's doing that, is that worthy of respect in a democratic society? Is apartheid democratic? Like, these are liberal arguments. Like, these aren't complicated arguments. You just have to go into court and say, Zionism is really racist. Like, that's not my opinion. Let's look at this stuff. And then you quote Smotrich and say, oh, here's the finance minister. He's a Zionist. What did he say? Well, I'm a fascist. Like, okay, so he's literally a fascist. So it's certainly compatible with fascism. You quote the ICJ order in the South Africa genocide case from January last year, 26th of January judgment, quotes these 3 senior Israeli officials. Like, that's Zionism. That's insanely racist. What, they're human animals. You're dehumanizing Palestinians. An entire nation is responsible. There's no innocent civilians. So the third point, so we should go on the offensive. We should go into court and just, like you say, be declaratory like our enemies are. Just say, like, who cares what you think? You're the British Empire. You colonized my homeland. You colonized Palestine. You're racist as anything. Just go into court and say it. And they're not used to it. They're like, what? And you just say it dispassionately and without moralism. You just, well, these are just facts. It's obviously a fact that the British Empire is one of the most violently colonial empires in human history. Like, that's not basis of any reasonable dispute, is it, my lord? And they're just like, oh, like, it's not that difficult. You just have to have some samud, as Palestinians would say, or some moral and political clarity. My third point is...
So many people lack that, though.
What can I say? People are scared. I think we cultivate courage collectively, but also we're disorganized. We should organize. We should train each other how to do this stuff. We should learn from each other. I was really... it was amazing to be in Derry. I felt very emboldened from being in Derry. Those people are miles ahead of us in terms of their resistance to colonialism. I keep saying all the street signs, the upside-down triangles have all been painted red. Victory to the PFLP everywhere. Like, amazingly emboldening to be in that space. And then I was also in Germany, which is the other end of the spectrum, where they're all, I think, understandably perhaps a bit on the back foot, feeling a bit deflated, constantly getting savagely beaten up by the cops, being arrested for saying from the river to the sea, like insane levels of just, go home Germany, you are drunk kind of thing. But even being there, it was great to have this cross-jurisdictional dialogue. There were some wonderful lawyers there. Alexander Gorski, friend of mine, brilliant lawyer, representing a lot of people in the movement. And we had this dialogue about, okay, so what's the correct strategy? And then we were looking at each other's kind of cases and witness statements and stuff and saying, okay, how do we learn from each other? How do we learn from each other's victories and defeats and stuff? My third point is, concretely, I think there's a number of challenges we could be bringing, and different people are focusing on different things. I think the low-hanging fruit is these regulators. Like, a case I did recently, I won't name the regulator. I mean, it's public knowledge, but whatever. A regulator recently tried to strip a professional of their right to practice their profession, and their formally pleaded case against him included a line to the effect, almost verbatim, it said something like, and it was taken from an expert report that had been drafted by an openly Zionist so-called expert on anti-Semitism, and the line said, in its true sense, anti-Zionism is to be construed as anti-Semitic because it contravenes such and such example of the IHRA definition. So just absurd, full frontal assault on anti-Zionism, even though we already have the benefit of David Miller's judgments. We know that's not right. They literally said the opposite. Like, no, like, people's anti-Zionist beliefs should be worthy of protection in a democratic society, like, depending on the facts of the specific belief. And yet you had this astonishing claim by a regulator like, well, actually, really, if you think about it like I have, anti-Zionism is inherently anti-Semitic. Insane. Completely insane. Just like irrational and unlawful, right? Staggering, disproportionate breach of people's right to freedom of expression, racist attack on Palestinians. Like, and I was saying in court in this case, I was like, and this is why the analogy with South African apartheid is helpful, even though it's liberal. You just go, well, look, there's 2 apartheid regimes that we're aware of, historically and legally. One was apartheid South Africa, one was Israel. Let's do a little analogy here and imagine Nelson Mandela. He was a lawyer. He gets dragged in front of his regulator for saying, I'm opposed to the ideology of white supremacy that is currently racially dominating me and other black Africans. And you say to that man, no, actually, you're racist against Afrikaners. That would be insanely racist. You just go into court and say this, and the judge was like, well, no one ever says that, but when you put it like that, that must be right. So they literally applied to amend their case. Once I came on the scene, I was like, what is this now? And they went, uh-oh. And they went, the game's up, man. You go into court and you just go like, what? You think all anti-Zionists are anti-Semitic? Like, okay, well, I'm here to tell you that I think all Zionists are racist. How do you feel about that? And they're just like, you can completely flip the script and you can turn it into, again, best defense, always a good offense. If your client has done something wrong, you should put in a sincere apology. You should be like he, such and such made a mistake, whatever, like things were said that shouldn't have been said. There was, Mohammed El-Kurd talks about a minefield, and I put this in one of my submissions in a recent case. Like, you ask people to run through a minefield, it's difficult to judge someone for stepping on a mine, but he nevertheless apologizes. And you can apologize to the people of Palestine. So I am sorry that I accidentally stepped on a mine and in so doing undermined your struggle for liberation. And then having put in that sincere apology, like, I made some mistakes, I did something racist and I apologize. And then you flip it and say, where's my apology? Where's the Palestinian people's apology from the British state for spending almost 2 centuries constructing a project of racist mass murder that views them as not a people? The land has no people. They're these subhuman savages that can be murdered en masse because they're not Jewish. Where's my apology? And in particular, the SRA, the BSB, the GMC, the Charities Commission, those are all incredibly vulnerable to a judicial review. And because we're in Britain, because everyone's very pressed, because the level of political consciousness here is still very low, because our side, the anti-Zionist radical left, is disorganized, we haven't yet brought those judicial reviews. But in my opinion, it would be extremely easy to win. You would just go into court and you look at the example of the SRA, the Solicitors Regulation Authority that regulates solicitors in this country. They receive training from Campaign Against Anti-Semitism. I cannot stress enough how insane that is. Campaign Against Anti-Semitism are openly racist. They're apologists for genocide and apartheid. They are apologists for the racist, fascist ideology of Zionism. The idea that a British state regulator should be receiving training from such openly racist people is obviously immoral and obviously unlawful. It's not just that they receive training from that and other organizations. It's that they routinely rely on so-called experts from these organizations, just openly racist apologists for an apartheid state while it commits a genocide. The idea that such a person should be coming into court and saying, yes, I'm an expert on racism, actually. It's like, you're extremely racist. And it's not difficult, when you get the right lawyer involved, to cross-examine such so-called experts and just say, just so we're clear, you've come to court today to suggest that you are an expert on fighting against racism. And then you just spend literally hours explaining to the court, like, you're extremely racist. And to be honest, they're so coddled. They're so used to being these respectable. They spent 5 years fighting against Corbynism. Like, I'm just concerned about anti-Semitism and I'm an anti-racist. And it's like they've been drinking their own Kool-Aid. And then you just take them into court and be like, oh, you're not in Kansas anymore. And then you just cross-examine them and you just literally say, well, you're really racist, aren't you? And they're like, no. And then you just explain for hours, like, yeah, you are. The easiest example, always the easiest example, you ask them a few questions, you say, you're a Zionist. Yes. That means you're in favor of maintaining a Jewish demographic majority in Israel. Is that right? And they go, yes. They almost always just say yes to that. And you're like, oh, so you're in favor of demographic engineering to ensure that a racial majority is maintained. Should we do that in Britain? It's so easy when you actually confront them with just hold up a mirror to them. And then you take them to the basic law of return, so-called 1950. Every Jew may return to Israel as an ole. You support that law, do you? Yeah. It's direct race discrimination, isn't it? Like, no, it's not. And you're like, look, come on, think about it. It's discriminating between Jews and non-Jews. It's direct race discrimination. And they're like, so you're in favor of direct race discrimination? And they're like, they have no answer. These people have no answer. They've never been challenged like this. But when you do, like, with humility, calmly, with facts, and without moral judgment, you just say, well, this is what you think. You support that law, do you? Yeah. And then you take them to the basic, the nation-state law. You're like, that's racist, isn't it? And they're like, oh, well, and then, the liberal Zionists are trying to, like, sort of backpedal their way out of it. You take them to the ICJ jurisprudence. You just go, well, it's an apartheid state, isn't it? They're like, and it's easy. It's like shooting fish in a barrel. You go into court and just be like, what? Who asked you? You're racist. Well, I'm not trying to be nasty. Like, you're just really racist, and you proclaim your racism every day in all kinds of ways. Like, which is fine. You do what you want. Like, be a Zionist if you want, but just don't lecture anyone on racism. You're an apologist for colonialism and apartheid. That's how we win. And in my opinion, these regulators are extremely vulnerable, and it's surprising to me that some of the groups that exist haven't just gone like, what? You can't do that. You can't treat campaign against anti-Semitism as experts. They're like unhinged headbanger Zionist freaks. Like, why are you asking them for advice on anything?
But I think the problem is that too few people have that moral clarity, have that bravery. And it shouldn't really be considered brave because, as you're saying, you're just stating matters of fact, things that can be evidence, things that are highly plausible and reasonable to say.
Can I just pick up on that bravery point? Because I think bravery is when you face a fear, right? Courage is about facing fear. And I think there are times when maybe I've done something brave, I've faced certain fears, but I don't think what I'm doing in court is brave because I'm not afraid, right? Like, you could call it fearless, but that just sounds overly self-congratulatory. I just don't think it's that big a deal. It's not that deep. It's like, you're a lawyer. Like, it's a cool, interesting job. There's no risk of violence to you. You just get to go into court and make interesting arguments. Just do it. Just go in and be like, all right, well, my client's an anti-Zionist, so just talk to them. And we had this conversation in one of my employment tribunal cases. We're still waiting for judgment on it. It's been a while. Obviously gave the judge a lot to think about. And I sort of said to them, well, look, you're anti-Zionist. Like, what kind of terminology do you want me to use? Like, obviously here they prefer to say Israel. Like, what do you want me to do? And they were like, well, we say Palestine, or we put Israel in inverted commas. And I was like, okay, do you want me to do that in the court? And they were like, yeah. And I was like, okay. And I just explained it. I was like, all right, well, where I come from. And I wielded my identity a bit in this case, but I sort of said, second biggest city in the occupied 6 counties is called Durra, if you're speaking Irish, or Derry, if you're speaking English. But if you're in favor of the colonial occupation of my country, you call it Londonderry. I understand that this court prefers to call it Israel, but my clients are anti-Zionist. We call it Palestine, or we put Israel in inverted commas. So for the duration of these submissions, that's what I'm going to do. And it very much depends on what your client wants. Like, sometimes the client will say, no, you're going to antagonize the judge. You can do this. If you actually care about what your clients want, you really listen to them. Hey, how do you want to play this? You want to be softly, softly catchy monkey? You want to go into court and do maximum damage to Zionism? What do you want? Listen to what your clients want. Enter into a real, sincere dialogue with them. Like, hey, how do you want to play this? And we can achieve amazing things together because, we're going to win. I just think we can achieve that. And if we don't, it would be a staggering victory for fascism. It would mean that an apartheid ethno-state can commit a genocide and get away with continuing to exist. Israel must not be allowed to continue existing. The game is up. We need to be, with diligence, with samud, with strategy, with moral clarity, with love, we need to dismantle that failed project in Jewish ethno-nationalism and replace it with something much more peaceful and much more hopeful. And I think we can, and I think we must.
Well, thank you very much, Frank. I mean, I think you've provided a lot of lessons, not just to your fellow lawyer colleagues, but to others who are actively involved in this movement and others in wider society in terms of how they should think creatively, how they need to step up. Because I think one of the biggest problems in the Palestine liberation movement is people adopting the worldview of the enemy, the language of the enemy. And we can't be thinking and acting within the apparatuses, within the parameters set out for us by genocidal colonial racists. So on that note, I thank you very much for joining me today, Frank. And thank you very much to all of our listeners and viewers. See you on the next one.